Nearly 2,000 years ago, the Romans built the first city of London on two small gravel hills by the Thames. Since then, it has grown. Slowly at first, and then more and more rapidly in the last 100 years, swallowing up mile after mile of countryside. So instead of fields, woods and marshes by the river, there are now miles and miles of busy streets. People, millions of people, with twice as many hurrying feet. And buildings which stretch away in every direction, with only a touch of green to be seen. Railways cutting deep gashes across the land from the suburbs and to the centre add their smoke to that of the power stations. From thousands of houses in the narrow streets, and the many kinds of industry. In many inner areas of London, the children only have the streets to play in, or odd patches of wasteland. Yet wildlife persists, even in the heart of this brick desert. The London pigeons, descendants of the wild rock dove of the sea cliffs, look for food under the feet of the crowds and flourish in London, despite the opposition of the authorities. Helped by people who feed them everywhere, their numbers are steadily increasing. Central London, though, is fortunate in its green squares. This is Lincoln Inn Fields, and here, where men watch games or girls, the office workers eat their lunch, while a cock blackbird looks for his. This species has increased greatly in the centre in the last 20 years, and though most nest in bushes in the squares and gardens, some are forced to find more unusual sites. Like this one, in a lamppost in an alleyway near Gray's Inn, safe and dry with its own central heating. Or in Russell Square, where one has its nest on the bars of a basement window. Other birds nest on buildings too, sparrows and pigeons, of course. But this brewery, near Whitechapel High Street, has the nest of a much more unusual bird, a grey wagtail, grey-backed, but with a canary yellow breast and a very long tail. The male has a black throat patch. Normally a bird we associate with quiet hills and fast-running streams, but here it is at home, and for 2 years has nested in the courtyard of this brewery, each year bringing off 2 broods. It finds insects on the water tank on the roof, and perhaps also by the Thames, which is not far away. Wood pigeons sometimes nest on buildings, but more often in trees. Sometimes in the busiest streets. Larger than the feral pigeons with a white half collar, shy and persecuted in the country, it's astonishingly tame in London. It's not worried by the people below, or the traffic. Trees are useful to sleep in too, and above the lunchtime crowd at the top of this birch tree, a tawny owl passes the day quietly, unseen by most. Nesting has occurred in most central parks, as well as in squares in Bloomsbury and South Kensington. He hunts at night, but a mile away, the daytime hunter, the kestrel, hovers. Nesting in a ventilator near the BBC. In 1900, the tawny owl was scarcer than the barn owl, but by the 1930s, well established. This plaque marks where the first bombs fell on the city. The bombs helped the kestrel and other birds when they destroyed many buildings and created great open spaces in the centre of the city. This was the largest of them, Cripplegate, around the Church of St Giles, where Oliver Cromwell was married, and one of the last to survive prior to the completion of the new Barbican. Flowers came quickly after the bombs, their seeds brought by the wind, birds and horses. The Oxford ragwort, one of the commonest and one of the first to flower in spring, and with the flowers came insects. This is a cinnabar moth. The rich insect life in turn provided food for many birds, like this wheatear, usually seen in London on migration in spring or autumn, though a pair may have tried to nest on the bomb sites in 1959. Stony hillsides or other barren places are their more usual breeding haunts. Elder bushes also thrived, their seeds brought by birds, especially starlings, which are very fond of their black berries. And buddleias, escaped from gardens, were especially attractive to butterflies, like this peacock, with its prominent eye spots. The rosebay willow herb was perhaps the most famous flower of the bomb sites. Each July it covered the ruins with a flame, as it does the burned forest areas of its native Canada. And in July, one of these ruined buildings might hold the nest of the most famous bird of the bomb sites, the black redstart. Sometimes high up, sometimes down in a basement, busy feeding its second brood. This small bird, related to the familiar robin, first bred in Britain about 40 years ago. It is one of the rarest birds in the country, yet for many years the City of London was its main headquarters, with up to a dozen pair present in some years. It fed on insects, a rather unobtrusive little bird. Although the red tail is noticeable if you get a good view, it has almost gone now from the city. Luckily, central London has its permanent open spaces too, especially the fine royal parks. The pigeons are at home here also, and just as tame. And from late autumn to spring there are many gulls. These are black-headed gulls, the smallest and most numerous. They come from far and wide, but most from the Baltic countries. One was known, from the Russian ring it carried, to have been born in Latvia and to have visited London at least 2 years running. Londoners like to feed the ducks all year round. An astonishing variety squabble for food below the bridge in St James's Park. Some are pinioned birds from overseas. Others are wild and free-flying. The teal, the smallest European duck, nests in southern England. The larger shelduck commonly nests on our coasts. The black and white straight-tufted duck is a diving duck and now breeds freely in most of the parks. And many more come to visit us each winter. The elegant drake pintail, another British duck. The pelicans are among the most famous of the park's exotic birds. As they fish, they keep perfect timing. The wood pigeons are tame here too, and this is a scene that would make a farmer choke. Voracious eaters that get very fat. They are increasing and their nests can be found from March to October. The moorhens with their red and yellow bills are also shy birds in most places, but have grown tame in many parts of London. Only 2 pairs breed in Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens. Even the large and graceful heron sometimes plucks up courage to appear here, though still rather shy, and subject to mobbing by gulls when it flies. Up to a tree for a quiet preen. The handsome little duck in the centre of this picture is a drake's mew. Almost pure white, with delicate black markings, a rare duck in many parts of the country, but it is still regular in the London area, and visits even the central parks occasionally. It breeds in northern Scandinavia. It's rather shy and keeps in the middle of the lake. It's mainly a fish eater and dives well. By March, the smew will leave us. But even before then, the black-headed gulls are getting their breeding plumage, rich chocolate hoods, not black. They also leave to nest. But the mallards stay on. Many nest in hollow trees and may lay 10 or 12 eggs and sometimes even more. There may be as many as 30 broods in Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens. The coots are in the grip of spring excitement. There are many fierce battles for nesting territories between the males, and sometimes the females will join in too. They build large nests near the bank or on some submerged structure. Mainly of twigs, but they will weave all sorts of adjustments into the nest. Leaves, reeds, or even an old newspaper. It's all rather public, but the coot doesn't seem to mind the people, but gets irritated with bird trespassers. And these tufted ducks will come too close. And now, what's this? A mallard with her family? Can't I have a bit of peace and quiet? The mallard ducklings hatch out early. They are great favourites with everybody. They're often quite bold, but they run quickly back to the water if danger threatens. It's safer near mother. Later, the young coots hatch. The mallard ducklings have to fend for themselves, but the coot parents feed their young regularly and carefully until they are quite large. Strange little objects they look, with their red and yellow markings on their head. But those marks serve a purpose. They act as a guide to the parent bringing food. They have bald heads, as you can see, but it's the white on the head of the adult which led to the old saying, bald as a coot. They have lobed feet, not webbed like the ducks, to which they are not related. Flowers are a big attraction in the parks. But Londoners like their own gardens as well. There are millions of them in the London area, of every size and shape, but nearly all proudly tended by their owners. They tend to get larger towards the outskirts. Gardens provide food and shelter for a high population of birds of many species. Here are two common ones, starlings and house sparrows. And many people help by putting out bread and other food. This is a hedge sparrow, one of the common birds of suburban gardens. Not really a sparrow at all, and some people prefer to call him a dunnock. A piece of fat stuck on a post is a good attraction. This is a coal tit, with its white mark on the back of the head, one of the smallest and most endearing of the tit family. The willow tit has an all-black head. Look for the light patch on the wing to distinguish him from the very similar marsh tit. It does not stay long, but flies off to hide the food, then quickly comes back for more. not found in central London, but nesting in Wimbledon Common, Cresolian Park, Rush Green. Unlike the marsh tit, it excavates its own nest. The blue tit is our commonest and best known tit. But the small birds all vanish when the great spotted woodpecker comes to feed. This is a female. She does not have red on her head like the male, but has a bright splash of colour under the tail. This is a successful and increasing species which nests in Regent's Park, Kensington Gardens and Holland Park. Note the specialised feet, 2 toes pointing forward and 2 back, useful for gripping a tree trunk. The great tit is our largest tit. It also has a black and white head, but look for the thick black stripe on its stomach. They like coconuts, and so does the blue tit. Or peanuts in a holder to which they can cling. The larger and less agile greenfinch is also managing quite well. This is the dull and less green female. She finds the flat top useful as a table. The robin is one of the most common garden birds. Robins choose some odd places for their nests. This one built in some boxes in a greenhouse. The bright coloured gapes of the nestings show the parents where to put the food. But watch carefully. If one fails to swallow it, the parent takes it away and gives it to one of the others. This is another robin, which had to pass a blackbird's nest on the way to its own, on an electric fire in a kitchen, and sometimes fed the young blackbirds by mistake. Here is the real parent. He does not mind some extra help with such a hungry brood. And starlings like odd places for their nests too. Often under the eaves of houses, but sometimes in a drain pipe, like this one. These children are looking after a baby from another nest hole, a young jackdaw which had fallen out. Jackdaws are common in some suburbs and further afield, but a scarce nester in inner London, the exception being this colony in Kensington Gardens, which has survived for 70 years or more. Garden flowers attract insects of all kinds. Here is a marsh tit feeding on them on red-hot pokers. Very like the willow tit, but without the light patch on its wing. This is a painted lady butterfly, feeding on the Michaelmas daisies. Every spring they make the long journey from as far away as North Africa to Britain, and none survive our winter. Birds need water too, for drinking and bathing. If you put out a bird bath, you will have many visitors. This is a young starling, still with its brown, unspeckled head and throat. The spotted flycatcher is much more sober and dignified, rather undistinguished in its plumage. Look for the streaks on the breast and head, and the slender bill. The goldfinch is an elegant bird. Once trapped in thousands as a caged bird, it has thrived under protection. A roost in Warwick Square supports up to 55 birds. But the bullfinch, fond of fruit buds, is still much persecuted. The green woodpecker may drop in when things are quiet. The largest and formerly the most common woodpecker in the London area, it feeds more on the ground than the other two. Its numbers are now mysteriously reduced compared with 10 years ago. But human beings need more water than birds. London has many reservoirs, mainly in the valleys of the Thames, Lee and Colne. They attract their own devotees, like these fishermen. Or strangely plumaged bird watchers who come out to look at the great flocks of waterfowl which find a safe refuge in the autumn and winter. At Barn Elms, not very far from the roar and bustle of Hammersmith Broadway, large flocks rest in peace. No shooting is allowed. These are mostly tufted and pockard, with the long white shapes of the less common goosanders in the background. Here is a closer view of the goosander. They are skillful catchers of fish, nesting in Scotland and Ireland. The females and immature birds have brown heads. Thanks to its reservoirs, London is one of the greatest sanctuaries in the country for wild duck. Well over 10,000 of 10 or more species in recent winters. When the water is calm, the goosander almost look as though they are skating. And these sleep in widgeon seem to float on nothing but their own reflections. When the spring comes, most of the duck, like these shoveler, fly away to nest. Everywhere the trees burst into blossom. The bees awaken and begin to feed. Toads gather for mating in March and early April, going to the same breeding pond to assemble for mating is sometimes a bit of a crush. Frogs are mating too, but a little more peacefully. But the more frogs, the more food for birds, especially herons. On this wooded island, on one of the Walthamstow reservoirs, there is a large heronry. Only 5 miles from St Paul's Cathedral and a few hundred yards from a cricket pitch and rows of houses. Herons are early breeders. They start to build or repair their old nests in May and lay their first eggs before the end of that month. An elegant bird with its long bill, well suited for spearfishing. From 50 to 70 pairs nest here each year. By April, there are young in some of the nests perched 20 to 30 feet up in the trees. The young are not quite as elegant. These are older. An adult flies in, and when it arrives, there may be a little more embroidery to be done on the nest. The young are feeling hungry. They watch eagerly as the parent comes through the blockade of carrion crows who harass the colony and are always ready to snap up an unattended egg or weakly youngster. The young are fed by regurgitation. The youngsters tug away at their parent's bill vigorously until the food arrives. Fish are the staple diet, but they also bring in frogs, eels, or even water voles. Food is only brought a few times a day. In between times, the young may find it rather warm. They pant to cool themselves, for they cannot perspire. Sometimes, especially when they are small, the parents will shade them from the sun with their wings. And when it is quiet, mother may take a nap too. The London area is particularly rich in other man-made lakes. The pits from which gravel has been extracted for building. There are dozens in all the river valleys, and they have increased greatly during this century. Luckily, for they too are great places for birds, like this meadow pit, feeding on the sedges. A small, rather undistinguished bird with a streaked breast. Some nest in London, and more arrive in winter. This little ringed plover is a much rarer bird. But the London area is one of the best places in the country to see it. For it finds the gravel pits, when they are being worked, just right for nesting. It's a relatively new nesting bird for Britain. Overhead are two lapwings, birds of farmland and wet pastures. They too find the gravel pits suitable for nesting. This handsome bird, with its fine crest, has a wild call which earned its other name, the peewit. Though it has declined in many areas in recent years because of predation by the much increased numbers of carrion crow, it is not uncommon in the London area, where it can still be found on open ground. The pied wagtail is a common nesting bird of the gravel pits, often building its nest in the machinery, and does not seem to be worried by the disturbance. More than 100 of these birds have a roost in Hammersmith Broadway. When all the gravel has been extracted and the work ceases, vegetation soon begins to cover the bare pits. These are hawksbeard. And this is water plantain. Later, the water crowfoot covers the surface with its pattern of white stars. And when there is enough to support a nest, the great crested grebe may come in to breed. This lovely bird is as common in London as anywhere, many wintering on the reservoirs and breeding on the gravel pits and other lakes. Before it was protected, hundreds were killed to provide feathers to adorn women's hats, and 100 years ago there were only 40 pairs in the whole country and none in London. Whereas London now has probably 140 pairs breeding. The swifts wheel over the gravel pits in summer. You can tell them easily from swallows and martins by their dark plumage and sickle-shaped wings. A common enough bird in the suburbs, nesting in the eaves of houses or in church towers. They arrive late, leave early, for they are dependent on flying insect life. Sewerage farms are attractive to birds, especially the old-fashioned type, which are now disappearing. The sprinkler beds are rich in food, and here the starlings gather in hundreds. Our own starlings are joined in winter by thousands from Northern Europe. Though these visitors stick mainly to the country areas and very few fly in to join the big central roosts, they have developed this into quite a game. Riding on the supporting wires and jumping neatly to avoid the revolving arms, a sort of Grand National where the fences come to you. The dainty yellow wagtail is one of the nesting birds on the sewerage farms, and of many suitable reservoirs. The nest in the long grass are quite hard to find. It has recently bred in Surrey docks and even near Vauxhall Bridge. 30 pairs used to breed between Greenwich and Plumstead before 1948. In the rougher, wetter and less accessible parts of the sewerage farms, you may find the reed bunting. This is the handsome black-headed cock. The female is drabber and more like a sparrow. In fact, in some places, this is called the pit sparrow, but it is a true bunting. The snipe, a rather scarce breeding bird now, but it must have been abundant when many marshes still flanked the Thames. Only 160 years ago, they were shot on the marshy area where Belgravia now stands. It's much commoner in the winter when you can see it feeding in the many wet areas, probing the mud with its long bill for hidden food, especially worms. The grey phalarope is one of the many attractive autumn visitors to sewage farms. Rare in most years, but numerous in some, it nests far away to the north, mostly beyond the Arctic Circle. Though one of the waders, it spends much of its time swimming, sometimes whirling round rapidly in the shallow water to disturb the organisms on which it feeds from the mud below. This bird is in winter plumage. In summer, they are much more colourful, and unlike most birds, the female has the brighter plumage, and after laying her eggs, leaves the incubation, and later the care of the family to the male. Now this sewage farm has gone, and a housing estate stands here. The common sandpiper is another bird of passage, seen both in spring, sometimes well into the summer and autumn, wherever there is a sheet of water. But it does not often nest in the London area, preferring the streams and lochs of wilder country. This rapid, bobbing action characteristic, it does it most of the time. It has a distinctive shrill piping call. In the North Kent part of our area are cement works, frosting the trees with dust. Here, a few of the natural marshes are still to be found by the Thames. Some of the reeds still survive, not yet entirely buried by rubbish or swallowed up by industry or houses. This is a cock stonechat. A few have nested in recent years at Raynham and on Mitcham Common. Reclamation may hold a temporary advantage for some birds. Mud and sand is pumped from the Thames behind, where the ships glide by to the sea. And this makes ideal conditions for wading birds. This dunlin, tiny and very common waders, are feeding by the river. But they leave it at high tide and fly to the flooded areas to feed. Most of them nest in Arctic Europe. The reclamation made a new breeding area for the ringed plover. This is a bird of our seashores, which has rarely nested in London. But in recent years, there have been several breeding records from Swancombe in Kent. Rye Meads and Stone Marsh, 48 pairs. It's a close relative of the little ringed plover, of course, which we saw earlier on the gravel pits, but it has a rather different head pattern and no bright yellow eye ring. The Thames is a main highway for all kinds of boats, but it still attracts birds. This mallard has found a solution to the shortage of nesting sites. Calmly sitting on a pile of lifebelts, unworried by the hundreds of people who used this pleasure launch on its many journeys up and down the river. But winter is the time most birds come to the river, especially gulls. Along the tide line, you will then find the common gull's greenish bills and legs. And the smaller black-headed. Black-headed, both lesser and great, have increased considerably in the last 30 years. It is rubbish of all kinds that attracts the scavenging gulls. And among the hungry flocks, you will often see mute swans. This elegant royal bird looks out of place among the flotsam and jetsam round the refuse barges. Ah, that's better. Here it looks truly regal, and the young cygnets are charming. After the war, there was a most striking increase in the numbers of swans in London and in many parts of the country, but now their numbers appear to be remaining fairly steady. This is the badge of the swan uppers. For in July, the swan plays the starring role in this ancient and colourful ceremony. It lasts a whole week. On the second day, the boats get ready near Hampton Bridge. The swans on the Thames belong to the Queen, the Dyers' Company and the Vinters' Company. The Swan Master has a swan's feather in his cap. At 10 o'clock, they set off and row up the river. The Dyers with blue flag, the Vinters red, and the Queen's white. They look for any swans with young, and when they see them, they manoeuvre the boats skillfully to trap them, and then close in. These swans have been badly oiled, and are quickly caught. You need to know how to handle a swan. They are taken upriver for cleaning. More oiled birds in December 1956, when an oil barge sank at Battersea. Over 200 swans were known to have died. Here is a pair with young. The cygnet is taken on board, the wings clipped and the bill cut with a special mark. The dyers have 1, the vinters 2 nicks on the bill, whilst the Queen get away with no nicks at all. Records have been kept for 150 years. And so it goes on for the whole week from Westminster to Henley, giving much entertainment to the many spectators. Her Majesty Swankeeper makes a note. A rowlock is useful for keeping a bird quiet. Then free for at least another year. Brawny chaps, these oarsmen, and it's hard work on a hot day, so there's no disgrace in taking a tow or pulling at the riverside pub for a refreshment. To good health. On their way up the river, the swan uppers past Hampton Court. Here, the fallow deer are tame and unmolested. And the sheep bring a rural touch. Hampton Court has its elegant palace, given by Wolsey to Henry VIII. And on the old buildings such as this, designed by Wren, there are small structures designed by house martins. Their nests are made of mud, carefully added piece by piece, very like swallows, and as they fly up to the nests, you can see the white rump which distinguishes them. On the other side of the river is Richmond Park, and the largest of the royal parks. The tall LCC flats in the background and the rushing cars on the road have not entirely spoiled it for wildlife. The red deer are a familiar sight, and there are no hunters or poachers to worry them, but many get killed by cars. The grey squirrel is common. Introduced from North America, it has replaced our own red squirrel in many areas. Nearby, siskins feed on the adler seeds in the winter, but these little birds will go further north, perhaps to Scotland, to nest. The nuthatch likes the old trees of Richmond Park for nesting. But the starlings are always ready to take over a nice hole from someone else. Even driving off woodpeckers after they have done all the hard work. But this nuthatch is lucky, and later he will make the entrance hole smaller with mud. This is a young male redstart. And this an adult. Redstarts have declined considerably around London in recent years. There are still a few woodlands left in the London area outside the royal parks. Here, a well-worn track tells us this is badger country. Quite a few still in the area, but they do not usually leave their holes until night, so most people don't see them. They will eat almost anything, from worms and beetles to acorns and apples. A young missel thrush sits by the edge of the wood, waiting to be fed. Missel thrushes are larger than the song thrush and more boldly spotted. They nest all over the area, even into the central parks and squares, and have gradually increased during the 30s and 40s. A pair of chiffchaffs have their nest nearby, tiny members of the warbler family, which come to us from the Mediterranean area and North Africa in the summer. They work hard, bringing insects to their young. Best distinguished from the very similar willow warbler by their song. The even tinier wren. The second smallest British bird is also hard at work rearing its brood. Here it brings a whole ball of tiny insects. It has its nest in this tree stump. Wrens are never still, usually creeping low in the vegetation, and have a remarkably loud song. The spotted flycatcher likes the edge of the wood, where it can perch on its lookout post and hawk for passing insects. You can see the stripes on the head and the streaked breast clearly. The nest still has eggs. It is very exposed, with only a piece of ivy stem as camouflage. Not much protection from the hot sun or enemies. Male and females have the same plumage. It is one of our last summer visitors to arrive, usually in May, and leaves by September when the insects are getting scarce, to winter in Africa, perhaps as far south as Natal. The heaths and commons of the London area still have some interesting birds, though life is difficult for them with more and more visitors in this motorised age. So some of the shyer ones have left. But early in the morning there is still peace and quiet. Fires, caused by carelessness, do a lot of damage to nesting birds and other wildlife. High on an old tree, a tree pipit sings. Like all the pipits, it is a rather plain little bird, but it has a beautiful song, often uttered as it parachutes down to its post. Linnets are found nearby. They used to be caught and kept in cages for their song. They have a dancing flight and an easily recognised call. If you get a close look, watch out for the crimson heads and chests of the males. The tree creeper constantly searches the bark for insects, working up one tree, then flying down to another and starting again. The crossbill uses its strange bill to extract seeds from pine cones. We only tend to see them in invasion years. In well-grown scrub like this, many birds nest. This is a bullfinch. The rather duller female is sitting. The male comes to feed her as she sits. He is a fine bird, with his rich red breast and velvet cap. No wonder they were favourite cage birds too. The heavy bill is what does the damage to fruit buds. Despite persecution, they have much increased in recent years. It's a very different story with the red-backed shrike, which has decreased everywhere. But if you are lucky, you may still find a nest on a common or waste ground. Again, the female is rather dull, but with attractive crescent markings on her breast. The cock is extremely handsome, and his black robber mask is not inappropriate, since shrikes are known as butcher birds, as they impale their prey on thorns to be called for later. They feed a lot on insects, but will also take mice, lizards, and even small birds. perching on a lookout post and dashing down on its prey. They build a large nest, often in clumps of brambles or hedgerows. Four pairs nested on Mitcham Common in 1954. The whitethroat is one of the most numerous birds of the commons, or any rough area where there is still dense undergrowth or bramble. Another warbler, which is a summer visitor from the south, you may see him on migration even in central London, as it has occasionally nested in the parks here, Regent's Park in 1953 and Holland Park in 1960. Its song is vigorous but not very musical, often uttered in flight. In winter on the commons, you may be lucky enough to see the great grey shrike. And when the berries come out, you may, if your luck is still in, also see the waxwing. They nest in Scandinavia and other parts of northern Europe. When the berry crops fall, the flocks may erupt into Britain. In a good waxwing year, you may see flocks of 20 or more. Now we can admire their beauty, their crests and the red, wax-like tips on their wing. The Dutch call the waxwing the pestvogel because they used to think its arrival meant a famine. They feed on all sorts of berries, hawthorn, cotoneaster, rosehips, and, if the supply holds, may stay until March. By then, the rookery is a hive of activity. But the odd farm still does exist in the London area. This one is near Ewell. Cowsheds and other farm buildings are a favourite nesting place for a bird which feeds on insects, the swallow. It is hardly a songbird, but it has a pleasant little warble if you're close enough to hear it. They will return to the same nest site year after year. Seen close like this, you can easily tell them from the house martin. Look for the red face and throat, the dark blue-black, and the long tail streamers, though young swallows have short tails and less colour. The sand martin is the third of the swallow tribe which nests in the London area. Like the others, it will perch readily on telegraph wires, but it is smaller and brown and white, with a brown breastband. It used to nest often in riverbanks, but now it often takes advantage of man-made sandpits to excavate its long, narrow tunnels. It is a colonial bird. There may be dozens or even hundreds of its nest in one colony, all close together. Like the swallow and the house martin, it returns to Africa to spend the winter, and this young bird will soon be making the long trip. A few unpolluted streams will remain on the outskirts of the London area, and here you may find the grey wagtail nesting. Specialised birds like this and many others are menaced all the time by the growth of London, the people, the buildings, the smoke, but they still hang on where they can and sometimes fight back. As we saw earlier, a pair of these birds have even managed to nest on such an unlikely site as a brewery in Whitechapel. The grey wagtail is busy all day gathering food for its young in the nest, hidden in the bank, and, as evening approaches, the starlings fly overhead on their way from their feeding grounds, back into the heart of London, to sleep. And as the birds fly in, so the city workers are hurrying out. And perhaps neither notices the other. In the winter, the starlings roost on ledges of the central London buildings, and their numbers are around 20 to 40,000. But in the summer, when they prefer to spend the night in the trees, they total as many as 100,000. Before they settle down for the night, they wheel and twist in huge flocks, and their skillful aerial manoeuvres are one of the most exciting of natural sights. And those starlings, truly adaptable London birds, who have learned to commute, bring us back to the centre of London, where our film began, where our story now ends.